The organist's fingers froze mid-chord. St. Catherine's Catholic Church held its breath on a humid Saturday afternoon in June 1982, as Thomas Whitmore stood 3 feet from the altar, close enough to reach his bride, far enough to flee. Catherine Hayes waited in her borrowed dress, a cream lace gown 2 sizes too large, cinched at the waist with a safety pin hidden beneath her bouquet of supermarket carnations. Sweat traced a line down her spine. The scent of melting candle wax mixed with her drugstore perfume, and the wooden pew behind her creaked as someone shifted, waiting for the inevitable collapse. She was 28, a single mother, a waitress at Marco's Diner on Highway 41. She had no family in the pews, no bridesmaids flanking her, no father to give her away. Just her 7-year-old son, Danny, sitting alone in the front row, swinging his legs and clutching a ring pillow he'd decorated himself with fabric paint. Thomas stood frozen, his jaw working like he was chewing words he couldn't spit out. Behind him, in the 3rd row on the groom's side, his parents sat rigid. Margaret Whitmore wore pearls and a look of pure disgust. Beside her, Richard Whitmore's face was stone. They'd made their position clear 3 weeks ago over dinner at the country club. Marry her, and you're out of the will, out of the business, out of the family. But it was the little girl in the flower girl dress who broke the silence. Daddy, no. 6-year-old Emily Whitmore stood up from the front pew, her white patent leather shoes clicking against the tile as she walked toward her father. Her voice was small, but sharp enough to cut through 200 held breaths. You promised. Thomas looked down at his daughter, his face cracking with something between grief and shame. Emmy, sweetheart, it's complicated. You promised you'd marry her. Emily's voice rose, trembling with a child's unfiltered fury. You said she was going to be my new mommy. You said we'd be a real family. Catherine felt her throat close. She'd met Emily only 4 months ago, after Thomas had finally introduced them at a park. The little girl had been shy at first, then warm, then desperate for affection in a way that made Catherine ache. Emily's own mother had died 2 years earlier in a car accident, and since then, the Whitmores had raised her with the cold efficiency of hired staff. But now Emily was looking at Catherine with tears streaming down her face, and Catherine realized the little girl wasn't just scared of losing a new mother. She was terrified of going back to the life she'd had before. Miss Catherine saved my life, Emily said, her voice breaking. And I'm not letting her go. The church erupted in whispers. Catherine's heart stopped, because she'd never told Thomas what happened that day. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if this story's already gripping you, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Thomas turned slowly toward Catherine, confusion written across his face. What is she talking about? Catherine's mouth opened, but no sound came. Her hands trembled around the carnations. Emily stepped closer to Catherine, reaching up to take her hand. The little girl's palm was damp and warm. It was at the pool, Emily said, her voice steadier now. In April, when Grandma took me to the country club. Margaret Whitmore stood up abruptly, her face drained of color. Emily, that's enough. No. The little girl's voice hardened. You said I wasn't allowed to tell. You said it would ruin everything. But you're already ruining everything, so I'm going to say it. Catherine's pulse roared in her ears. She remembered that day. She'd been delivering a catering order to the country club kitchen, a side job she'd picked up to save for Danny's school clothes. She'd heard the splashing, the panicked shouts, the chaos of adults frozen in shock. and she'd run. I fell in the deep end, Emily said, looking up at Catherine with eyes full of devotion. I couldn't swim, and nobody helped me. They just stood there. Catherine closed her eyes. She could still feel the cold shock of chlorinated water, the weight of the child in her arms, the gasping, choking relief as Emily coughed up water on the pool deck. Miss Catherine jumped in, Emily continued. She pulled me out. She saved me when nobody else would. Thomas stared at Catherine, his face a storm of emotion, shock, gratitude, fury at what he hadn't been told. Margaret Whitmore sank back into her pew, her hands shaking. And Catherine finally understood. The Whitmores hadn't just opposed this marriage because she was poor. They opposed it because she knew what kind of people they really were. The kind who watched a child drown rather than risk their dignity by diving into a pool fully dressed. What happens when a family built on image confronts a woman who's already seen them at their worst? The confession hung in the air like smoke. Thomas turned toward his mother, and the look on his face was something Catherine had never seen before. Not anger, but a slow, dawning horror that came from realizing you'd been lied to by the people you trusted most. Margaret Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line. She straightened her pearls with trembling fingers, but her composure was already cracking. Around them, the church had gone silent. Even the rustling of programs had stopped. Thomas, this is hardly the time, Margaret began. You knew. His voice was low, dangerous. You knew she saved Emily, and you never told me. Richard Whitmore stood, his hand gripping the back of the pew. Son, we can discuss this later. No. Thomas's voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling. We're discussing it now. Catherine felt Emily's hand tighten around hers. The little girl was shaking, but she didn't let go. On the other side of the aisle, Danny had stopped swinging his legs. He watched his almost stepfather with wide, worried eyes. Thomas knelt in front of his daughter, his hands on her shoulders. Emmy, tell me exactly what happened. The little girl took a breath, her voice steadier now that her father was listening. Grandma took me to the pool. She was talking to her friends. I wanted to show her I could jump in, but I slipped on the side and fell into the deep part. Emily's eyes filled with tears again. I went under. I couldn't breathe. I tried to swim, but I didn't know how. And where was your grandmother? She was still talking. She didn't see me fall. Emily wiped her nose with the back of her hand. But her friends did. Mrs. Pemberton and Mrs. Ashford. They saw me, they were pointing. But nobody came in. Catherine remembered the two women in their white tennis skirts, frozen at the pool's edge, shrieking for help but not moving, not ruining their hair, not risking their reputations by making a scene. How long? Thomas asked quietly. I don't know. It felt like forever. Emily's voice broke. Then Miss Catherine came running. She still had her apron on. She jumped in the water and pulled me out. She did the thing where you push on someone's chest, and I coughed up all the water. Thomas stood slowly, his face white. He turned to his mother. You were there when this happened. It wasn't a question. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in her life, she had no answer that would save her. We handled it discreetly, Richard said, stepping forward. The club manager agreed not to file an incident report. We compensated the woman for her troubles. You paid her off? Thomas's voice rose. My daughter nearly drowned because your friends were too concerned about their hair to save her, and you paid Catherine to keep quiet? Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. She'd never been paid. She'd been escorted off the property by security. told the Whitmores would handle the situation, and warned not to discuss it with anyone if she wanted to keep her catering contract. She'd lost the contract anyway 2 days later. "We were protecting the family," Margaret said, her voice icy now. "That woman is a nobody, a waitress. She had no business being at the club in the first place." "That woman saved your granddaughter's life." The words came from Father Donnelly, the priest who'd been standing silent at the altar. He was an older man, 70 at least, with white hair and a face carved by decades of hearing confessions. He stepped forward, his vestments rustling. "I've been a priest in this parish for 42 years, Father Donnelly said quietly. "I've married 3 generations of Whitmores, baptized your children, buried your dead." He paused. "But I will not marry you, Thomas, if you walk away from this woman today. Not because of who she is, because of who you would become if you did." The church was silent. Catherine felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She'd cried enough in her life, when her husband left her pregnant and alone, when she'd worked double shifts to keep Danny fed, when she'd knelt beside his bed at night, wondering if love was enough to make up for everything they didn't have. She wouldn't cry now. Thomas looked at his daughter, then at Catherine, then at his parents. "I need to know something," he said quietly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret's composure finally shattered. "Because we knew you'd do exactly this. You'd throw away everything we've built, our name, our legacy, our place in this community, for some waitress with a bastard child." The slap echoed like a gunshot. It was Emily who'd done it. The 6-year-old had let go of Catherine's hand, marched up to her grandmother, and struck her across the face with all the strength a child could muster. "Don't call Danny that," Emily said, her voice shaking. "And don't call Miss Catherine names. She's the only one who's ever been nice to me." Margaret staggered backward, her hand pressed to her reddening cheek. Richard moved toward his granddaughter, but Thomas stepped between them. "Don't," Thomas said quietly. "Don't you touch her." He turned to Catherine, and for the first time since he'd frozen at the altar, she saw clarity in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I hesitated. I'm sorry I let them make me doubt. And I'm sorry I didn't know what you did for Emmy." Catherine's voice was barely a whisper. "You don't owe me anything." "Yes, I do." Thomas reached for her hand. "I owe you everything." He turned to Father Donnelly. "We're ready." But before the priest could speak, the church doors burst open. A woman stood silhouetted in the Florida sunlight, her hair wild, her dress torn, and Catherine recognized her immediately. Because it was Thomas's first wife, the one who was supposed to be dead. The woman swayed on her feet. Her name was Diane Whitmore, and she was supposed to have died in a car accident on Interstate 75 in December of 1980. Her body burned beyond recognition. Her closed casket funeral attended by half of Palm Beach County. But here she stood, very much alive, her face gaunt and her eyes hollow, wearing a floral dress that hung off her frame like it belonged to someone else. Emily made a sound Catherine had never heard before, something between a gasp and a sob, raw and animal. The little girl's legs buckled, and Catherine caught her before she hit the floor. "Mommy!" Thomas had gone rigid, his face drained of all color, his hands hanging useless at his sides. Around them, the church erupted in shocked whispers, heads turning, voices rising. Diane took a step forward, gripping the doorframe for support. Her hair was lighter than in the wedding photos Catherine had seen, bleached by sun or chemicals, streaked with gray. Her bare feet left dusty prints on the white runner. "I'm sorry," Diane said, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, but I had to come. I had to stop this." Margaret Whitmore rose from her pew, her hand still pressed to the cheek Emily had slapped. "This is obscene. Richard, call the police. This woman is clearly disturbed." "Sit down, Margaret." Father Donnelly's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Everyone, please, sit down." The authority in his tone was absolute. People obeyed. Catherine knelt beside Emily, who was shaking so violently she could barely stand. Danny had crossed the aisle and now stood protectively beside them, his small hand on Emily's shoulder. The two children, almost siblings, united in their terror. Thomas finally found his voice. "You're dead." "I know." Diane's laugh was bitter, broken. "I've been dead for 20 months, and it was easier that way. For everyone." "What are you talking about?" Thomas took a step toward her, then stopped, as if afraid she'd vanish if he got too close. "The accident. The police. The funeral. There was an accident." Diane's eyes were glassy, unfocused. "But it wasn't me in that car. It was a woman named Sandra Meeks, a hitchhiker I'd picked up outside of Tampa. We looked similar enough, same height, same build. When the car went off the bridge and caught fire," she closed her eyes. "Your parents identified the body, Thomas. They knew it wasn't me. They knew." The accusation landed like a bomb. Richard Whitmore was on his feet again, his face purple with rage. "That is a damned lie." "Is it?" Diane's eyes snapped open, and for the first time Catherine saw not weakness but fury. "You came to see me in the motel 3 days after the funeral. You brought a briefcase with $50,000 in cash and a one-way ticket to California. You told me if I ever came back, if I ever tried to contact Thomas or Emily, you'd make sure I was arrested for fraud, for abandonment, for anything you could think of." The church was silent now. Even the whispers had stopped. Thomas turned slowly to face his father. "Tell me she's lying." Richard's jaw worked, but no words came. Margaret spoke instead, her voice cold and controlled. "Your wife was unstable, Thomas. She was drinking, using pills. She was going to destroy this family. She was sick." Diane's voice rose, cracking with emotion. "I had postpartum depression after Emily was born. I was drowning, and nobody would help me. Your mother told me I was weak. She said Whitmore women don't break. She took Emily away from me for 3 months and told me I wasn't fit to be a mother." Catherine felt Emily stiffen in her arms. The little girl's breathing had gone shallow and fast. "I tried to get better," Diane continued, tears streaming down her face now. "I tried so hard, but every day in that house felt like dying. And when I finally couldn't take it anymore, when I drove away that night, I wasn't trying to disappear. I was just trying to breathe." Thomas's hands were shaking. "Why didn't you come back? After the accident, after you realized what happened, why didn't you tell me you were alive?" "Because I believed them." Diane's voice dropped to a whisper. "Your parents told me you'd moved on, that Emily was thriving, that I'd only hurt her if I came back. They said you were already seeing someone new, someone who could give Emily the stability I never could." Her eyes found Catherine. "They didn't tell me you were getting married. I only found out 3 days ago when I saw the announcement in the society pages." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The Whitmores hadn't just hidden the pool incident. They'd orchestrated their daughter-in-law's disappearance, paid her to stay gone, and built a new life for Thomas on the foundation of a lie. And now Catherine understood why they'd fought so hard against this marriage. Because if Thomas married her, a woman with nothing to lose, a woman who'd already saved their granddaughter once, he might finally see his parents for what they truly were. Father Donnelly stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Whitmore, Diane, do you have proof of what you're saying?" Diane reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a crumpled envelope. The motel receipt, the plane ticket, and a recording. She held up a small cassette tape. "I recorded our conversation that night. I didn't know if I'd ever need it, but I kept it just in case." Margaret lunged forward, reaching for the tape, but Thomas caught her wrist. "Don't." His voice was dead, empty. "Don't you dare." He released his mother and turned to Diane. "You recorded them bribing you to disappear." "Yes." "And you stayed gone for 20 months." "Yes." Diane's voice broke. "Because I was a coward. Because I believed them when they said Emily was better off without me. But when I saw that wedding announcement, when I saw that you were marrying someone else..." Her eyes found Emily, still trembling in Catherine's arms. "I realized I couldn't let my daughter grow up thinking I'd abandoned her. I couldn't let her believe I didn't love her." Emily pulled away from Catherine and took a single, tentative step toward her mother. "You left me." The words were small, but they carried the weight of 2 years of grief. Diane sank to her knees, her face crumpling. "I know, baby. I know I did. And I'm so sorry. Grandma said you didn't want me anymore. That's not true." Diane was sobbing now. "I wanted you every single day. I just didn't know how to be strong enough for you. But I'm here now. And if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I never stopped loving you." Emily stood frozen, caught between the mother who'd left and the almost mother who'd stayed. And Catherine realized, with a clarity that hurt, exactly what she had to do. What happens when the right choice means letting go of everything you thought you wanted? Catherine stood slowly, Emily's hand slipping from hers. The church felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, every eye trained on the impossible tableau. A bride, a groom, a ghost, and 2 children caught in the wreckage of adult decisions. The June heat had turned the sanctuary into a pressure cooker, sweat beading on foreheads, tension crackling like lightning before a storm. Catherine smoothed her borrowed dress and took a breath that tasted like candle wax and regret. "Emily," she said softly, "go to your mother." The little girl's head snapped around. "No." "Sweetheart, you saved me." Emily's voice rose, desperate. "You jumped in the water when nobody else would. You're supposed to be my new mommy," Daddy promised. Catherine knelt again, taking Emily's face in her hands. The little girl's cheeks were wet, her eyes red-rimmed and terrified. Behind them, Diane remained on her knees, silent, watching. "Your real mommy is here now," Catherine said gently. "She came back for you. That's what you've been wishing for, isn't it? Every night before bed?" Emily's face crumpled. But what if she leaves again? The question hung in the air, raw and honest in the way only children can be. Catherine looked over Emily's head at Diane, and what she saw there wasn't the polished society wife from the wedding photos. It was a woman who'd crawled out of hell, scraped and bleeding, to get back to her child. "She won't," Catherine said, though she had no right to make that promise. "Look at her, Emmy. Really look at her." Emily turned slowly. Diane was weeping openly now, her hands pressed to her mouth, her whole body shaking with the effort of not reaching for her daughter before she was ready. "I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough before," Diane said through her tears. But I'm stronger now, and I will never, ever leave you again. I promise on everything I am. Emily took one step toward her mother, then another. Then she was running, crashing into Diane's arms with enough force to knock them both backward onto the white runner. They clung to each other, sobbing, 2 years of grief and longing pouring out in the middle of St. Catherine's Church, while 200 people watched in stunned silence. Catherine felt her own tears finally break through. Not for herself, though God knew she'd be crying later, alone in her apartment, mourning the family she'd almost had, but for the little girl who'd been brave enough to speak the truth. Thomas stood frozen, watching his daughter and his supposedly dead wife, his face a mask of shock and dawning understanding. He turned to Catherine, and the look in his eyes nearly broke her. Catherine, Don't. She held up a hand. Don't apologize, don't explain. Just go to them. This doesn't change how I feel about you. Yes, it does. Catherine's voice was steady now, certain. And it should. She's Emily's mother. She came back. You can't marry me when your wife is alive, Thomas. You know that. We could figure something out. No. The word was firm, final. I won't be the other woman, and I won't be the reason Emily loses her mother again. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. You hesitated at this altar because you knew something wasn't right. You were honoring that instinct. Now you know why. Thomas's eyes were bright with unshed tears. You saved my daughter's life. And now I'm giving her back her mother. Catherine managed a small, sad smile. That's what you do when you love someone. You give them what they need, even when it costs you everything. She turned to Danny, who'd been watching everything with the quiet wisdom of a child who'd learned too young that life wasn't fair. He came to her without being called, slipping his hand into hers. We going home, Mama? Yeah, baby. We're going home. Before Catherine could take a step toward the aisle, Father Donnelly's voice stopped her. Wait. The priest had been standing silent through all of it, bearing witness. Now he moved toward the Whitmores, his expression carved from granite. Richard, Margaret. His voice carried the weight of 4 decades of moral authority. You have a choice to make, right now, in front of God and this congregation. Richard's face was still purple with suppressed rage. Father, this is a family matter. This is a matter of souls. Father Donnelly's voice rose, filling the sanctuary. You paid a woman to disappear. You let your son believe his wife was dead. You let your granddaughter grow up thinking she'd been abandoned. You stood by and watched that child nearly drown, rather than risk your precious reputation. He paused, letting each accusation land. And now you have a chance to do one decent thing, to confess what you've done, to beg forgiveness from the people you've hurt, or you can walk out of this church and never come back. The silence was absolute. Margaret straightened her spine, her hand dropping from her reddened cheek. When she spoke, her voice was ice. We did what was necessary to protect this family's legacy. Then you've chosen. Father Donnelly's face was infinitely sad. You're no longer welcome in this parish, not until you've made amends for what you've done. Richard grabbed his wife's arm. Come on, Margaret. We don't need to listen to this. They walked out together, backs straight, heads high, as if they were leaving a disappointing restaurant rather than the smoking ruins of their family. The church doors slammed behind them with a finality that felt like judgment. Nobody stopped them. Nobody tried to defend them. and in their absence, something shifted. Thomas crossed to where Diane still knelt with Emily, and slowly, carefully, he sank down beside them. Emily looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, and reached out one small hand. He took it. Then he took Diane's hand, and the three of them sat there on the floor of St. Catherine's Church. Not a picture-perfect family, but something more real. Broken people trying to find their way back to each other. Catherine felt Danny tug her hand. "Mama, can we go now?" She nodded, unable to speak. As they walked down the aisle past the silent congregation, Catherine heard Emily's voice one last time. "Thank you, Miss Catherine, for everything." Catherine didn't turn around. If she did, she'd fall apart. Outside, the Florida sun was merciless. The church parking lot shimmered with heat, and Catherine's borrowed dress stuck to her back. She had no car. Thomas had been supposed to drive them to the reception, and no money for a cab. Just her son's hand in hers, and the certain knowledge that she'd done the right thing, even though it hurt like dying. She was halfway across the parking lot when a car pulled up beside her. Not Thomas, not Diane. Someone who'd been watching from the back pew all along. Someone who'd recognized Catherine the moment she'd walked into that church. And who'd been waiting 20 years to repay a debt. The car was a 1976 Buick LeSabre, powder blue with rust blooming along the wheel wells. The woman behind the wheel was perhaps 60, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that had seen too much. She leaned across and opened the passenger door, the hinges creaking in the heat. "Get in, Catherine. You too, son." Catherine froze. She didn't recognize the woman's face, but something in her voice triggered a memory she couldn't quite place. Something old and buried deep. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" "You did. A long time ago." The woman's smile was sad. "My name is Ruth Pemberton, and I owe you more than I can ever repay." The name hit Catherine like cold water. Pemberton. One of the women at the pool. One of the women who'd stood frozen while Emily drowned. Danny tugged her hand. "Mama, I'm hot." Catherine's instinct was to walk away, to refuse help from someone who'd been complicit in that moment of cowardice. But the Florida sun was brutal, and Danny's face was flushed, and she had nowhere else to go. She got in. The car's interior smelled like menthol cigarettes and vanilla air freshener. Ruth pulled out of the parking lot without a word, heading east on Ocean Boulevard, away from the church and the wreckage Catherine was leaving behind. "Where are we going?" Catherine asked quietly. "My house. It's 10 minutes from here. You and your boy can cool off, have something to drink, and figure out your next move." Ruth glanced at her. "Unless you'd rather I just drive you home?" Catherine lived in a studio apartment above Marco's Diner. One room with a hot plate and a Murphy bed and a bathroom shared with 3 other tenants. The thought of going back there right now, still in this borrowed wedding dress, still feeling the ghost of Thomas's hand in hers, was unbearable. "Your house is fine. Thank you." They drove in silence for a while. Danny pressed his face to the window, watching pelicans dive into the Atlantic. Catherine kept her hands folded in her lap, feeling the weight of the carnations she'd finally set down on the church steps. "I was there that day," Ruth said finally. "At the pool. When you saved that little girl." "I know who you are." "Then you know I'm one of the people who didn't help her." Ruth's voice was steady, but Catherine heard the shame beneath it. "I stood there in my tennis skirt, and I watched that child go under, and I didn't move. I told myself someone else would handle it. The lifeguard, a staff member, anyone but me." Catherine said nothing. You were wearing a catering uniform, Ruth continued. You were carrying a tray of sandwiches when you heard her fall in. You dropped that tray. I remember the sound of the silver clattering on the concrete. And you ran. You didn't even take off your shoes. You just jumped. The memory was vivid. The shock of chlorine burning her eyes. The weight of Emily's small body. The way the little girl had coughed up water onto Catherine's shoulder while Margaret Whitmore stood 10 feet away, her face carved from ice. After you pulled her out, Ruth said, Margaret thanked you. Do you remember? She shook your hand and said the family would be in touch. Then security escorted you off the property like you'd committed a crime. I remember. I went home that night and I couldn't sleep. Ruth's hands tightened on the steering wheel. I kept seeing that little girl's face underwater, kept seeing myself standing there doing nothing. The next morning, I called Margaret. I asked her what she was going to do to thank you properly, to compensate you for what you'd done. Catherine's throat tightened. What did she say? She told me the matter had been handled discreetly, that you'd been paid for your trouble and signed a non-disclosure agreement. She said the family didn't want any publicity about the incident because it would reflect poorly on the club. Ruth's voice cracked. I believed her. I told myself it was resolved, and I went back to my tennis lessons and my bridge games and my comfortable life. They pulled into a driveway. The house was modest by Palm Beach standards. A single-story ranch with a screened porch and a garden that had gone slightly wild. Ruth killed the engine, but didn't get out. 3 months ago, I ran into you at the grocery store. Do you remember? Catherine did. She'd been buying day-old bread and marked-down produce, stretching her paycheck as far as it would go. Ruth had been in line behind her, had looked at her for a long moment, and then looked away. I recognized you immediately, Ruth said. And I realized Margaret had lied to me. You hadn't been compensated. You'd been silenced. And I'd been too much of a coward to check. Danny had fallen asleep in the back seat, his head against the window, exhausted by the emotional chaos of the day. Catherine watched his chest rise and fall, grateful he couldn't hear this conversation. Why are you telling me this? Catherine asked quietly. Because I've been following the wedding announcements. I knew Thomas was marrying you, and I knew Margaret and Richard would do everything in their power to stop it. Ruth turned to face her. I was at the church today because I thought you might need a witness, someone who could testify to what really happened at that pool if they tried to destroy your reputation. It doesn't matter now. The wedding's off. I know. I saw everything. Ruth's eyes were bright with tears. And I saw you give up the man you love so a little girl could have her mother back. That took more courage than I've ever had. Catherine felt her composure finally crack. The tears came hard and fast, 2 days' worth of fear and hope and loss pouring out in Ruth Pemberton's driveway. The older woman reached over and took her hand, saying nothing, just holding on while Catherine fell apart. When the storm finally passed, Catherine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing the drugstore mascara she'd applied so carefully that morning. I don't know what to do now, she whispered. You do what you've always done. Ruth's voice was firm. You survive. You take care of your son. You keep moving forward. She paused. But this time, you don't do it alone. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a check, not for thousands, not for the kind of money that would solve all Catherine's problems, but enough. Enough for first and last month's rent on a better apartment. Enough for Danny's school clothes and maybe a used car. enough to breathe. I can't accept this, Catherine said automatically. Yes, you can. Consider it 20 years of back pay for saving a child's life. Ruth pressed the envelope into her hands. And consider it an investment. Because I know you, Catherine Hayes. You're the kind of woman who jumps in when everyone else is afraid to get wet. And this world needs more of that. Catherine stared at the check, at this unexpected grace, and felt something shift inside her. Not hope, not yet, but the possibility of it. What she didn't know was that inside St. Catherine's Church, Father Donnelly was having a very different conversation with Thomas Whitmore, one that would change everything again. Father Donnelly found Thomas sitting in the front pew, his head in his hands. The church had emptied slowly, guests filing out in uncomfortable silence, unsure whether to offer congratulations or condolences. Diane had taken Emily to the parish hall, the little girl exhausted, clinging to her mother like she might disappear again if she let go. Now the sanctuary was quiet except for the tick of the wall clock and Thomas's ragged breathing. "May I sit?" the priest asked. Thomas nodded without looking up. Father Donnelly lowered himself onto the pew with the careful movements of a man whose knees had logged too many hours kneeling on stone. He said nothing for a long moment, just sat there in his vestments, hands folded, waiting. "I don't know what to do," Thomas said finally. "About your wife? Or about Catherine?" "Both. Neither." Thomas lifted his head, and his eyes were red-rimmed. "How do I make sense of any of this? My wife is alive. My parents orchestrated her disappearance and lied to me for 20 months. The woman I was about to marry walked away so my daughter could have her mother back. And I'm sitting here wondering if I'm relieved or devastated or both." "Probably both," Father Donnelly said gently. "The human heart is large enough to hold contradictory truths." Thomas leaned back against the pew, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. "I loved Diane once. When we first married, before Emily was born, she was brilliant, funny, full of life." He paused. Then she got pregnant, and something changed. She became anxious, then depressed, then unreachable. My mother said she was being dramatic. That motherhood required sacrifice, and Diane was too selfish to make it. "And you believed your mother." I didn't know what to believe. Thomas's voice cracked. "Diane was struggling, but every time I suggested therapy or medication, my parents said it would reflect badly on the family. They said she just needed to try harder, to be stronger." He closed his eyes. "I failed her. I let them convince me her pain wasn't real." Father Donnelly was quiet for a moment. "And Catherine?" Thomas's face softened. "Catherine is everything Diane wasn't, stable, grounded, present. She makes me feel like I can breathe. And Emily adores her. These past 4 months, watching them together." He stopped. "I thought I was building a new life, a better one. But maybe I was just running from the mess I'd made of the first one. Or maybe," Father Donnelly said carefully, "you were trying to find your way back to being a good man after your parents spent years teaching you to be something else." The words landed like a benediction. Thomas looked at the priest, this man who'd known him since childhood, who'd watched him grow up under Margaret and Richard's careful cultivation. "You think they made me this way?" "I think they tried to." Father Donnelly's voice was firm. "But the fact that you're sitting here wrestling with your conscience tells me they failed. A truly corrupted man would have walked away from Catherine without a second thought, would have let his parents' money and influence solve every problem. You didn't." I hesitated at the altar. "Because some part of you knew the foundations were unstable. That's wisdom, not weakness. The priest leaned forward. Thomas, you have two women in your life right now who both deserve honesty. Diane needs to know if you can forgive her for leaving, if you can rebuild a marriage that was broken long before she disappeared. And Catherine needs to know that her sacrifice wasn't in vain, that you're not going to spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been. What if I can't give Diane what she needs? What if I try to make it work for Emily's sake and it falls apart again? Then you'll deal with that when it comes. But you owe it to all three of you, Diane, Emily, and yourself, to try. Father Donnelly stood, his knees cracking. And you owe it to Catherine to let her go with a clear conscience. Don't make her your escape plan if things get hard. Thomas sat with that for a long moment. Through the stained glass windows, late afternoon sun painted the floor in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere in the parish hall, he could hear Emily's laughter, a sound he hadn't heard in 2 years, bright and unguarded. What do I do about my parents? That's between you and God. Father Donnelly's voice was gentle but unyielding. But I'll tell you this. True family isn't about blood or money or legacy. It's about who shows up when everything falls apart. Who jumps in the water when others are afraid to get wet. Thomas thought of Catherine, dripping chlorine water. Emily coughing in her arms while his mother stood frozen. Then he thought of Diane, gaunt and desperate, walking into a church to reclaim the daughter everyone told her to abandon. Both women had shown more courage than he'd managed in 36 years of life. I need to talk to Diane, he said quietly. Really talk to her. Not about Emily or my parents or what went wrong. Just talk. That's a good place to start. Thomas stood straightening his tie, trying to summon some dignity from the ruins of the day. Father, can I ask you something? Of course. Catherine, she's going to be all right, isn't she? Father Donnelly smiled, and it was the saddest, wisest expression Thomas had ever seen. Catherine Hayes has been surviving impossible things since the day she was born. She'll be more than all right, but she won't be yours, and you need to make peace with that. Thomas nodded, the finality of it settling in his chest like stone. He found Diane and Emily in the parish hall, sitting at a folding table covered in construction paper and crayons. His daughter was drawing something, a house with 3 stick figures, a sun, a tree. Diane watched her with tears streaming silently down her face, as if she couldn't believe she was really there. Thomas pulled up a chair. Hi. Diane looked up, her eyes searching his face for judgment, anger, rejection. Hi. I think we should talk, Thomas said. All 3 of us, about what happens next. Emily set down her crayon. Are you mad at Mommy? No, sweetheart. I'm not mad. Are you mad at Miss Catherine? The question caught him off guard. No, I could never be mad at her. Good. Emily picked up her crayon again, adding a 4th stick figure to her drawing, standing separate from the others, holding the hand of a smaller figure. Because she saved me. And now she saved Mommy too. Thomas looked at the drawing and understood. Catherine wasn't just giving Diane back to Emily. She was giving Thomas the chance to be the father and husband he should have been all along. The weight of that gift would stay with him forever. Outside, the Florida sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of coral and gold. And somewhere across town, in Ruth Pemberton's modest house, Catherine Hayes was learning that sometimes the worst day of your life could also be the beginning of something new. But the story wasn't over yet, because Ruth Pemberton had one more secret to share. Ruth Pemberton's kitchen smelled like lemon polish and coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. Danny was asleep on the living room couch, covered with a crocheted blanket, his mouth slightly open, one hand curled under his cheek. Catherine sat at the kitchen table, the check still in her hands, trying to make herself believe it was real. Ruth poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, set one in front of Catherine, and sat down with a heaviness that suggested what came next wouldn't be easy. "There's something else you need to know," Ruth said. "Something I should have told you 20 years ago." Catherine looked up. 20 years? Ruth reached into a drawer and pulled out a photograph, its edges soft with age. She slid it across the table. The photo showed 2 teenage girls, maybe 16 or 17, sitting on a beach blanket. One had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Ruth, Catherine realized, decades younger. The other girl was blonde, laughing at something off camera, her hand shielding her eyes from the sun. Catherine's breath caught. The blonde girl looked exactly like her. "That's my sister," Ruth said quietly. "Her name was Mary Walsh. She died in 1962, 3 months after that photo was taken. She was 17 years old." Catherine's hands trembled. "I don't understand." "Mary got pregnant that summer. The father was a boy from the wrong side of town, a mechanic's son with no prospects, no family money, nothing Margaret Whitmore's generation would have approved of." Ruth's voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. "When my parents found out, they sent her away, to a home for unwed mothers in Georgia. They told everyone she was spending the year with relatives up north." The coffee sat untouched between them, cooling. "Mary wrote me letters," Ruth continued. "She was scared but trying to be brave. She said the baby was a girl, that she was going to give her up for adoption because she didn't have any choice, but that she'd named her before letting her go. She named her Catherine." The room tilted. "Mary died 3 weeks after giving birth. Infection. By the time I found out, she'd already been buried in a cemetery outside Atlanta." Ruth reached across the table, covering Catherine's hand with her own. "And the baby, you, had been placed with a family through a closed adoption. I tried to find you. For years I tried, but the records were sealed, and I had no legal standing, no rights." Catherine couldn't breathe. "You think I'm her daughter?" "I know you are." Ruth pulled out another photograph, a hospital bracelet, a birth certificate with the mother's name listed as Mary Walsh and the father listed as unknown. "I hired a private investigator 5 years ago. When I saw you at that grocery store, something about your face, I knew. It took time to confirm, but these documents don't lie." Catherine stared at the birth certificate. June 19th, 1962. St. Mary's Home for Unwed Mothers, Savannah, Georgia. Her birthday. "The family who adopted you," Ruth said gently. "They were good people." Catherine thought of the Hayes family, a foster placement that had become permanent when she was 3, after her adoptive mother died, and her adoptive father, a railroad worker, had kept her anyway. He'd been kind but distant, dead of a heart attack by the time Catherine was 14. After that, it had been state homes and group facilities until she'd aged out at 18. "They tried," Catherine said quietly. "But I was mostly alone." Ruth's face crumpled. "I'm so sorry. If I'd found you sooner, if I'd fought harder, you were a child yourself when it happened." "I was 17, old enough to have done something." Ruth wiped her eyes. "After Mary died, my parents never spoke of her again. They packed away her things, removed her photos from the walls, and pretended she'd never existed. I married young, trying to escape that house. moved into the social circles where silence was currency and reputation was everything. She paused. I became exactly what they wanted me to be, until I watched you save that little girl and realized I'd been living my sister's death over and over, watching people suffer while I stood by and did nothing. Catherine looked at the photograph of the two teenage girls, trying to see herself in the blonde one's features. The nose, maybe. The shape of the jaw. Why are you telling me this now? Because you walked away from a wedding today thinking you had nothing left. No family, no future. Just you and your boy against the world. Ruth's voice strengthened. But you're not alone, Catherine. You have an aunt. You have family history. You have a mother who loved you enough to give you a name before she let you go. She paused. And you have me if you'll let me try to make up for 28 years of absence. Catherine felt something break open in her chest. Not grief, but something older and deeper. The loneliness of a child who'd never quite belonged anywhere. The fear that she was fundamentally unlovable. The certainty that she'd always be on the outside looking in. All of it, built on a lie. I have an aunt, Catherine whispered, testing the words. You do. And a cousin, my daughter Rebecca. She lives in Atlanta with her husband and 2 kids. They don't know about you yet, but they will, if you want them to. Catherine thought of Danny, asleep in the next room. How many times had he asked about grandparents, cousins, a family tree that extended beyond just the 2 of them? How many times had she told him they were enough, just them, and seen the disappointment in his eyes? I want them to know, Catherine said. Ruth smiled through her tears. Then I'll call Rebecca tonight. And tomorrow, if you're willing, we'll start building what should have existed all along. They sat in silence for a moment. 2 women separated by a generation, but connected by blood and grief and the kind of courage it takes to jump in when everyone else stands frozen. Ruth, Catherine said quietly, thank you. For the money, for the truth, for everything. You don't need to thank me for telling you who you are. Ruth squeezed her hand. You've always been Catherine Walsh. Now you just know it. As the sun set over Palm Beach, Catherine felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, but its foundation. The sense that maybe, just maybe, the ground beneath her feet was solid after all. And somewhere across town, Thomas Whitmore was learning his own hard truths about family, loyalty, and the cost of living a lie. But that night belonged to Catherine, the woman who'd jumped in the water, the woman who'd walked away from the altar, the woman who'd finally come home. 3 years passed like water finding its level. Catherine Hayes, Catherine Walsh, she'd learned to call herself, stood in the doorway of her small bookshop on Clematis Street, watching the morning light turn the storefront windows to gold. The shop specialized in children's books and local history, and on Saturdays, she hosted story time for neighborhood kids. Danny, now 10, helped her shelve returns and recommended books to customers with the confidence of someone who'd finally found his place. The check from Ruth had been the beginning. A better apartment. A used car that actually started in the morning. Breathing room to think about something beyond survival. But it was the family that had changed everything. Ruth's daughter Rebecca flying down from Atlanta with her kids. Cousins Danny had never known existed. Sunday dinners, birthday parties. The ordinary, extraordinary gift of belonging. Catherine had never married. Some nights she thought about Thomas Whitmore, wondered how he was doing, if he and Diane had managed to rebuild what they'd lost. She'd heard through Ruth's society connections that they'd moved to North Carolina, seeking distance from the Whitmore name and all it represented, that Emily was thriving, that Thomas had started a small construction company, building things with his hands instead of his family's money. She hoped it was true. She hoped they were happy. The bell above the shop door chimed, and Catherine looked up expecting a customer. Instead, she saw a young woman, maybe 22 or 23, with dark hair and familiar green eyes. "Are you Catherine Walsh?" the woman asked. "I am." The woman smiled, and Catherine's breath caught because she knew that smile, had seen it every day for 4 months, 28 years ago. "My name is Emily Whitmore," the young woman said. "Well, Emily Chen now. I got married last year." She paused, gathering courage. "I don't know if you remember me, but I remember." Catherine's voice was soft. "You were 6 years old and brave enough to tell the truth when no one else would." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I've been looking for you for 2 years. My dad finally told me where you were." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "He wanted me to give you this. He said he's been trying to write it for 28 years and finally found the words." Catherine took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in careful handwriting. "Catherine, Emily is getting her doctorate in social work. She specializes in postpartum mental health advocacy. Diane teaches art therapy at a women's recovery center. I build affordable housing for single mothers. We became the people we are because you showed us what courage looks like. Thank you for jumping in when no one else would. Thank you for walking away when staying would have been easier. Thank you for teaching my daughter that love means doing the hard, right thing. We're all still here because of you." Thomas Catherine folded the letter carefully, pressing it against her chest. When she looked up, Emily was watching her with the same intensity she'd had as a child, as if Catherine were something precious that might disappear if she looked away. "Would you like some coffee?" Catherine asked. "I'd love to hear about your work." Emily's face lit up. "I'd like that very much." They spent the morning in the bookshop, talking about Emily's research, about Diane's recovery, about the family they'd all built from the wreckage of that June day. And when Emily finally left, promising to return, to bring her husband, to introduce Catherine to the life she'd helped make possible, Catherine stood in her doorway and felt the weight of 28 years finally lift. She'd lost a wedding but gained a family. She'd walked away from love but found herself. She'd jumped in the water and discovered she could swim. They say that on certain summer afternoons, if you walk past St. Catherine's Church in Palm Beach, you can still hear the echo of a little girl's voice saying, "You promised." Some claim it's just the wind through the stained glass. Others swear it's a reminder that the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth, even when everyone else is afraid to speak. If this story moved you, leave a comment telling us about a time someone showed you courage when you needed it most. And subscribe so you never miss another story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things.